welcome to the Christ Pearls channel. This is Jessica, and today I wanted to do another short video about the book of Revelation and looking at it as a temple drama. Essentially what we're looking at is the plan of salvation, the story of the world that we live in, and this time that we live in mortality. If you remember in the last video we did, that was just like a short 20-ish minute video, we were talking about the four horsemen, and we looked at just some of the ideas that help us see how these horsemen represent mortal trials. So hopefully that kind of gives you a little refresher, but we talked about the white horse representing conquest and tyranny, unrighteous dominion, which leads to the red horse. The red horse represents war, contention, warmongering, civil unrest. That leads to the black horse, which is famine, economic oppression, greed, oppressing the poor, price manipulation, things that cause famines for the poor. It leads to the pale horse, which in the Greek is like a yellowish greenish that represents death. It's like a corpse color, and this is sort of like all of these bad things that exist in the world. It's like all of the evil and oppression that exists in mortality. We talked about mortal trials, and so this is the idea here. We're looking at the plan of salvation, and just kind of our experience here in mortality is what these things represent. So today we're going to do something similar. We're still in chapter 6 of Revelation, and I'm just kind of starting here because this is what pertains to us. I'll go back at some point and we can look at some symbolism in the earlier chapters, but let's go to our church resources here. So for the Institute, there's all kinds of great resources on the book of Revelation. We have like a summary of the 7 seals, where you can see how each seal represents a different period in the total story, the complete story of the earth. And remember that 7 is a biblical number that represents completion. And one thing that Gerald Lund had pointed out, and this is part of our Gospel Library app resources too, but just how these seals, it's like you can see how the majority of the verses that are in the book of Revelation pertain to the opening of the 7th seal, and the restoration happens here in the 6th seal. Like this Revelation chapter 6 verses 12 to 17 is kind of like where the restoration begins, and then you can see that the majority of this book is spent on all this time that leads up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. This is important because it just shows you what's important in this book. It's in the middle. And there's very few verses spent on the millennium and then like that final period when the earth is celestialized at the end of this whole entire story, this mortal existence. The reason that I bring that up is because this is important for us in terms of how we look at it and prioritize it. If we're looking at it through the lens of the temple, and we're trying to see the temple drama, like the plan of salvation story in the book of Revelation, I think it starts to help it make a lot of sense. And then you can maybe understand why Joseph Smith said it's like the plainest book. So for example, in chapter 6 verses 12 to 17, which we're going to specifically look at in our study guide, it notes that this is where great calamities and signs are shown on earth and in heaven. This is what I want to look at. Now remember that every prophet sees the same thing. They all see this great apostasy followed by the restoration, and this leads to the second coming. So like a full restoration of the house of Israel, the gathering of Israel is what precedes the second coming. And this is like a process. This isn't one event, obviously. So this, from the time of the restoration forward, the gathering of Israel commences. This leads to the second coming, and then Israel continues to be gathered all the way through the millennium. This is like the whole story of the earth and our time in mortality. Okay, so think about it that way. And then let's go look at Revelation chapter 6. So we talked a little bit about those horsemen already. We talked a little bit about like the 5 covenants in the Old Testament in the last video. In this one, you can think a little bit more about the 5 covenants that you make in the temple. Maybe just kind of have it in your mind, because I'm going to bring up something that has to do with that. And what I want to look at is when we go down here to verse 12, I'm going to pull up my annotations. So think about what it says here. We're going to read it really quick, then we're going to talk about it. So it says, "And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" So this is important because we know that wrath of God is what essentially cleanses the earth from everything telestial. It's part of what helps us get from the telestial world to this terrestrial world for the millennium. And the gathering of Israel is taking place in here. We can see a couple of things, like, for example, the heaven departed as a scroll when it's rolled together. This is important because we're talking about the first vision, we're talking about the restoration, and about the heavens opening as a scroll, because for a long time the heavens were closed. There was no new revelation. And we see that because there was the great apostasy. And then this heavens opening as a scroll is the restoration. This is what John saw. Okay, this is a Book of Revelation overview that was pulled from an Ensign magazine. And it just helps you understand on a very high level visually how John is seeing all these things. And so when you see those verses, this is what it's talking about. It's talking about signs preceding this great day of the Lord when the restoration begins. And we're studying Doctrine and Covenants in the year 2025 for the Come Follow Me. So maybe this is a good lesson to think about in the book of Revelation, and how this is part of God's plan. This is part of the whole story of how God saves his people, how he brings us back into his presence. And this is the temple drama. So let's go back over here to Revelation chapter 6. So some things to think about. So when you're looking at these verses in Revelation 6, 12 through 17, you can compare these descriptions that we just read to like actual things that have happened in the world. And you can see how it is talking about the restoration. It's so clear. And I think the figurative language can be a little confusing maybe, or maybe it's just hard to decipher if you don't have the restored gospel, but having it, it becomes very clear. So for instance, there's all these major things that happened that are essentially what's described here in verse 12. So we look, when the six seals open, there's a great earthquake, the sun becomes the black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon becomes as blood. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So we have earthquakes that precede the first vision, which is in 1820. There's a big, huge one in Syria that's noted, that's on record. You can look this up. There's a series in Italy. There's a solar eclipse that passes over America in 1806. Then there's this big, huge earthquake in America in Missouri, which we all know is where Adam Adi Amen is. This is where Adam dwelt. This is a huge spot for church history. This is where the New Jerusalem will be. And there was an 8.2 earthquake. Some said 8.1, some said 8.2. When I looked this up, there were 4 aftershocks. This carried on from December of 1811 to January of 1812. So the aftershocks kind of happened over that time period. And there's also a comet that this was concurrent with. It's called Tecumseh's Comet, or Napoleon's Comet, and you can Google this, but basically it was a comet that was visible around the globe for 17 months. and it was at its brightest during the New Madrid earthquakes. And the comet, it has an orbit of 3,065 years, so it was last seen during the time of Ramses II in Egypt. And we also saw an annular eclipse on September 17th in 1811 over the northern USA across like the northeast coast. In 1812, there was an annular eclipse. It was on February 12th, 1831. This eclipse was instrumental in a slave uprising that was led by Nat Turner. He witnessed this eclipse and took it as a sign from God to begin an insurrection against slaveholders. And remember how important that prophecy that Joseph Smith made about the Civil War was, because he said that once this war happens, war is going to continue to be poured out over the whole earth. That did happen. Now, in 1815, this was really important. This was noted in the book Saints, Volume 1, the Tambora volcano. It created a huge smoke and ash cloud, dark skies. It affected the crops worldwide because it led to kind of like a sort of like a nuclear winter. And this actually caused the Smith family to move to Palmyra. Originally, they were in Vermont. And then this is where the first vision happened. This is where the plates were buried, where Moroni put them for Joseph to find. And so these are key events. And now go back and look at verse 12 here. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. Okay, New Madrid. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. Tambora volcano. The stars fell unto the earth, even as a fig. Okay, so where's that? If you keep going, there's a few more events here. So Joseph, he receives the plates from Moroni. This was in 1827. This is coinciding with a Jewish feast of trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah. And he sees in the sky, Heber C. Kimball also sees a sign that he called this the eventful night of September 22nd, 1827. And this was from Orson F. Whitney's Life of Heber C. Kimball, page 15 to 17, that he noted this. There was a sign of a woman in the sky, or the Revelation 12 sign. So we can go over to Revelation chapter 12 and just kind of remember what that was. But there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. So this is the Revelation 12 sign. And Heber C. Kimball had noted this, and you can look back and see that that happened at that time when Joseph got the plates. And if you think about the woman and her representing the church and this child representing Zion, what this people that she needs to bring forth to be prepared for the Savior when he comes, then, I mean, you can kind of see how, even though this language in the book of Revelation is very, very figurative, it's clearly talking about this important point in time. And when you start lining up this book with Isaiah and all the other prophets who've talked about last days, Daniel is another one. You'll see John is pulling from all of those prophets like Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Zechariah, all of these guys. And he is using all of the figurative language from those prophets to create his narrative, which is, again, another way to look at this as a temple drama, the full story of the earth from beginning to end, like our whole time in mortality. It even references the premortal existence, because there's some allusions there too, and parallels there too, so there's layers. But what's so interesting is these specific verses, Revelation 6:12 through 17, when the sixth seal is opened, this is the restoration is beginning. And the first, it's hard to know exactly like how literal to take the numbers. However, at the very least, we can agree that these are epochs, and scholars agree that there's 7 epochs, and they may or may not all be literally 1,000 years. There's just scholarly debate about that. If you don't look at it literally and you're looking at it more figuratively in through the lens of the temple drama, then you can understand why so much time is spent on the seventh seal, because this is the millennium with a lowercase m that leads to the millennium with a capital M. So if you keep going through here, in 1833, right after the church is established in 1830, there's this meteor shower. It's the Linoid meteor storm. And this was all over the newspapers. You can Google this one too. Images will pull up, articles will pull up. Meridian Magazine did an article on this. I've already covered it on the channel. And since I want to keep this video short, I'm not going to be looking up any of these things. You'll just have to go back and look at former videos. But I did one about the eclipses. I did one about the Exodus repeated. I did one where we talked about signs in the heavens. And these are where these things are mentioned. But you can Google them too. And it's easy to find. This was a big event. This was noted in several journals in church history. A lot of people saw this. And you look at the stars fall from heaven, as even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she's shaken of a mighty wind. These are all signs in the heavens, signs in the earth that help you understand it's marking something important. And what that is the first vision and the heavens being opened again to revelation after being closed for so long during the great apostasy. And this is just something to think about maybe this year as we study the Doctrine and Covenants. So this message is going to come out of the heavens being open. And what is that message? It's a message of warning. Think about Parley P. Pratt, a voice of warning. Think about Doctrine and Covenants section 1, which we read recently in the Come Follow Me as we've started off this new year. And think about the message there about the coming of the bridegroom and being ready for the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And that's what this is talking about. It's saying that a message is going to go forward to all the kings of the earth, to all the great men. People are going to flee from this. People will hide themselves from it. The mountains, it's going to be talking about all the nations. It's literally like talking about the message of the gospel rolling forth like Daniel prophesied, and what it does in the earth and how it helps to change the world. And that's what's happening. So with all of that in mind, there's a lot of things here I noted in church history, just kind of leading up to like different important points in time, like the Council of 50s established. We can see the kingdom of God kind of being established in the political and ecclesiastical sense. Of course, this kind of gets stifled, and you can look at Revelation chapter 12. It's all about this. Revelation chapter 12, you're going to have to look at the Joseph Smith translation because it's completely different. And if you go look it up in the Joseph Smith translation, I'm not going to pull it up just because I'll have to open scripture notes or somewhere else to open it. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just go back and read that and think about church history. Have that in mind. And you can see how this is a story of what happened in church history. And when you see like the stars fall and how there's like, 3.5 is like symbolic of a period in the wilderness. I mean, you can think about the exodus that the saints made from Nauvoo to Salt Lake and how they literally traveled across from east to west out to the desert. And you can think about how 8 of the 12 apostles, or the original apostles, apostatized, but then some of them came back. So essentially it was a third part. So it says, and his tail drew the third part of the stars from heaven and did cast them to the earth. So we can look at that as, you can kind of see a parallel there between like what was happening in church history and what's happening in Revelation chapter 12. And so this really truly is a story about the world. The history of the world is what's being told here. And what's so interesting about this is, at least for me, I was thinking about how there are some similarities between ancient Israel, or like the layout geographically of the original land of Israel where God had his people dwell, and Utah. there's like a mirror image. So like right here in this little blog post, I've covered this before in my Exodus Repeated video, where we looked at the article Exodus Repeated by President Nelson. It was originally a BYU speech that got published in the Ensign because it has so much doctrine in there. It's a good article. Everyone should read it. I'm not going to explain it, but essentially it talks about how there's parallels between the Exodus that was started by Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and it likens Joseph Smith to Joseph in Egypt and Brigham Young to Moses, and then to the ancient crossing over the Red Sea that Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt on. And these two Exoduses are important because we're talking about the gathering of Israel. We're talking about God working with his people again, a new dispensation. And there's parallels between these lands geographically, which should clue you in to, maybe pay attention to what's happening here. See ancient Israel and modern Israel. Now, with that in mind, there's these eclipses, okay? And there's patterns in these eclipses. So there's the woman in the sky sign. It happened when Joseph got the plates. Well, it also happened again in 2017, around the same time as this eclipse, okay? It was like a month after the eclipse. So there's the eclipse in August 21, 2017, and then April 8th, 2024, we just had another. This marks that location where we see the saints moving from east to west. There was another eclipse that was the ring of fire that went down right through Salt Lake, right through Utah. I mean, it's just, it went right over the Manti Temple. I watched it from the Manti Temple, and it sort of marks a path, like an area where the saints traveled, and it's kind of highlighting important places in church history. And I think this is really fascinating because I see this as part of these signs and wonders, signs in the earth, signs in the heavens, that help me remember everything that happened in church history. But then we have these identical ones over the Middle East on August 2nd, 2027, and then March 20th, 2034, they're going to pass over the Red Sea. And we know that the first Exodus in Israel's history took place there with Moses. And then President Nelson had linked that story with the Exodus to Salt Lake from Nauvoo. So there's just all this like symbolism here that it makes me think of Revelation chapter 12, Revelation chapter 6, church history, ancient Israel's history. I mean, obviously Revelation chapter 12 can be viewed as like a premortal story too. There's layers there. It can be applied in all these different time periods, as well as our time, as well as these last days, this end time. And, the Aleph and the Tav, first and last, it reminds me of that concept of the first and the last. It reminds me of Joseph in Egypt and his story, which is really our story. We are the ones who have to bring the stick of Joseph and the stick of Judah back together. It's Ephraim's mission, Ephraim and Manasseh, like the tribes that are descended through Joseph. We have a responsibility in the last days to gather the tribes of Israel, and that's happening. In fact, this year, if you look at your April, it's like the week that ends on April 6th of your Come Follow Me, you'll see how in that lesson they have us looking back at President Nelson when he spoke to the youth, and he talked about how the tribes are being gathered out. And they had talked about, how Sister Nelson asked, like she wanted to get to know people by tribe, and she had them all stand up, and they brought that up. And I can't imagine that this is included in our Come Follow Me for no reason. Obviously, it's to show us that the gathering of Israel is happening and how big it's getting, that the tribes are returning one by one, and we're fishers of men. We're fishing them all out. And so it just sort of speaks to me about the gathering of Israel. Another thing that I've noticed with these eclipses, this is just a diagram that I made, and I've showed this in a previous video too, where I talked about the Exodus repeated, but they have these 5 time blocks. These eclipses happen about just shy of every 400 years. So the last time they would have happened would have been in like the Pilgrim days, like right at the beginning of the Reformation, which is what helped get us to a point in American history where the restoration could occur. And I think that there's some significance there too. And I mean, all those, that dark time of the great apostasy, it's like, that's like a black hole. We don't really have a lot of revelation coming out of it because the heavens were closed. Like basically up to where the Book of Mormon ends is as far as it goes for us. And then it's like the revelations are closed. And they open up again with Joseph Smith and the first vision. Well, I can see how this like eclipse in August of 2017 all the way to the one in the end of 2034 at March 20th, 2034, this is an interesting period. I see these 5 time blocks. I can see that in the middle, this date, which I labeled, I just kind of named it this, the eclipse chiasmus, which is the midpoint between the first eclipse and the last eclipse, beginning in America and ending in the Middle East. And this is December 4th, 2025. And I started to think about some symbolism in relationship to these eclipses. Like, for example, I could see the Roman watches. There's like 4, Roman watch periods. I could see there's kind of like a midpoint here. I could see maybe a little bit of symbolism in the stars with regard to the zodiac or the Mazzaroth. And I could see how it kind of reminded me a little bit about different prophecies pertaining to the gathering of Israel. There's Joseph and Judah that need to be gathered, and then we need to gather out of the heathen nations. And this goes back to those 4 key appearances of Jesus Christ in lesson 36 of our Doctrines of the Gospel student manual for the second coming. And there's like Adam on Diamond, and then Christ appears in New Jerusalem, which is Joseph, and then he appears at Old Jerusalem, which is Judah, and then we gather the rest of the tribes from among the heathen nations, and this is right prior to the second coming in glory. And I thought of the different like symbolism with regard to the harvest. Barley has to be harvested with a light shaking, wheat with a heavy beating, grapes with a severe crushing, and then olives, they need 3 presses. And out of those 3 presses, you can get 3 different levels of olive oil. The first press being the most special, the holy oil, and then the second being, for food, and then the third for like lamps. And, just the seasons, March and April's barley, May and June's wheat, grapes is kind of like August to mid-October. And then olives is like October, November. It can actually go into January. And so it's just speaking to me of like the fall feast. And when Christ came the first time, he fulfilled the spring feast. But maybe when he comes the second time, he'll fulfill the fall feast. I'm not really sure, but it definitely had me thinking along those lines. And so anyway, I've just been thinking about some of these things, including temple symbolism, because I can see that there's these 5 periods between these eclipses that are exactly 1211 days, like 1,211 days. And it made me think of the 5 covenants that we make when we're going through the endowment, this idea of ascension, this idea of refinement, the fat kind and the lean kind, the 7 years of plenty, the 7 years of famine. I mean, there's just so many different things that this made me think of, and it really had a lot to do with the imagery there of how it's marking these 2 lands where 2 exoduses occurred. And it's hard for me not to think of the gathering of Israel when I'm looking at something that reminds me of the Exodus, the ancient Exodus or the modern Exodus. So anyway, I'm just going to end this video here because I don't want to get too deep into this. I have a lot of commentary on the book of Revelation that we can read through. And at some point I'd like to do some deep dive videos, but just when you're thinking about the temple and you're thinking about the relationship that it may have with the symbolism in the book of Revelation, think about Revelation chapter 6 verses 12 through 17, and then also chapter 12, and think about it in regards to church history, to the restoration, and to how important this is, because this is what helps prepare the earth for that day of burning and wrath. And remember what Malachi said, if it's not for this, then the whole earth's purpose is wasted. And so we're preparing the world for the second coming of the Lord, because this is what the whole point of the restoration is. This work's been going on since the restoration began. I mean, remember how, too, in when the Salt Lake Temple was dedicated, and how we saw Wilford Woodruff talk about those 4 angels, those harvesting angels, that he said that they had went out. So on April 6, 1893, the Salt Lake Temple was dedicated, and Wilford Woodruff said that those 4 angels of the harvest would go forth in the earth. This is the separation of wheat from tares, and this is another symbolism that we can see that pertains to the restoration and the purposes of gathering Israel to prepare the world for this second coming, this harvest, this wrath that will precede the second coming of the Lord. So anyway, these are just a few thoughts. I want to keep this short, but hopefully that was something interesting, food for thought. You can take that with you next time you go to the temple and you're thinking about the plan of salvation and the importance of the restoration and what it really means and why we're really doing everything that we're doing. Why temples? Why family? Why gathering in this way into this covenant? It's to prepare for this great day of the Lord. And I know that the Savior is coming again. I'm not sure exactly when that's going to be. I know there's people who kind of look at the eclipses as a timeline. I'm not really sure if it's a timeline for the second coming, but I will say that I do see symbolism there, and I feel like it's definitely reminding me of 2 exoduses, one in church history and one in ancient Israel's history. And I think it's just hard to look at this and not see that. So that's what it reminds me of. It makes me think about the gathering of Israel and how there's some important things happening here. You know, maybe this is a time where the stick of Joseph and the stick of Judah will come together. I'm not sure. I guess we won't really know until 2034. But I mean, President Nelson's told us that we should buckle up and prepare to see some of those things that Nephi talked about. I guess we'll see what happens. And then I think about Elder Stevenson. He talked about this next decade from 2024 to 2034 being a really big, important decade for the church. Well, these eclipses mark that time frame. And I don't know. I guess we'll see what happens, but I hope that that's food for thought. And I just want to suggest maybe thinking a little bit more about the temple drama when you're reading the book of Revelation, and think about that when you're reading Doctrine and Covenants this year for the Come Follow Me.